been killed in an attack on a TV tower and a Holocaust memorial here in the capital. Meanwhile, a 40-mile-long convoy of Russian reinforcements is closing in on this city. Today, we saw evidence of the devastation it could bring. At least 10 people were killed when Russian missiles and rockets targeted the cultural centre of Ukraine's second city of Kharkiv. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Russia of committing a war crime. Our security and defence editor Deborah Haynes has this now on the Russian assault.
In one moment, everything changed. A Russian cruise missile piercing the heart of Ukraine's second city. Carnage, chaos, and inevitable casualties. They hunt for survivors in the wreckage of the local government building, carefully carrying away the dead.
There is a lot of damage. There are killed and wounded, a lot of them.
This place was renamed Freedom Square after Ukraine regained its independence from the Soviet Union. Now, it symbolises the threat this country's freedom once again faces. No longer clean-shaven, Ukraine's wartime president addressed EU politicians. His desire to join the bloc and their desire to welcome him, unbowed by Russia's pressure not to.
We are fighting for our rights, for our freedoms, for life, for our life. And now we're fighting for survival. And this is the highest of our motivation.
But what a price Ukraine is paying. A TV station in the capital struck, while miles of Russian armour masses around the outskirts, while miles of Russian armour advance towards the city. Caught in the crossfire are families like Sophia's. She and her 3 children take shelter in the basement of their apartment block whenever there's danger.
How has it affected your children, this situation?
Well, my middle child, Mark, he is probably the one who has reacted, who's been hurt the most, because he can't really understand. That's been the hardest on him. My daughter, she's older, she's just grown older in a day, in a minute.
And how are you finding things at the moment?
It's a bit hard. Well, the hard thing, the only hard thing, well, for me right now is to make my brother understand that
the war still has a way to run as civilians too vent their fury. This footage taken in the coastal city of Melitopol. Defiance, but also much more danger in the days ahead. Deborah Haynes, Sky News, Kiev.
Well, cities right across this country are preparing themselves for a Russian escalation. Sky's Alex Rossi spent the day in Dnipro, southeast of Kiev, where people have been creating makeshift bomb shelters and preparing weapons. Alex sent this report on Ukraine's defence.
Every night now, the air raid sirens wail and people scramble for safety. This war is getting uglier as men, women and children cower for another night in the darkness.
Мы не знаем, куда упадет ракета, что будет с нашим городом, кто сюда зайдет и как все будет через 5 минут. Поэтому последние несколько дней мы живем в аду.
This is a place that is awaiting its fate. The United Nations is moving all non-essential staff and their families. This group heading for the border. On the roads to the south, Ukrainian armour rumbles to meet the growing threat. These troops advancing to reinforce the defence of this region. Inside the city, there is an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion. As rumours of Russian spies circulate, this man was detained at gunpoint. And all the time, roads and buildings are being fortified. This is a fight for the soul of this country.
I'm here because I think that everyone should unite in our efforts, and maybe I can't kill someone, but I can help in other way.
These people want to fight, but for now will offer their support any way they can. The territorial defence has so many volunteers, they can't all join at once.
There is a real sense of fear and apprehension. People are extremely scared about what is happening to their country, but the levels of resistance here are immense. It seems that anyone who is able to pick up a gun or fill up a sandbag is coming forwards in defiance of the Russian invasion.
David has enrolled and is making Molotov cocktails to defend his city.
Это не только военные делают. Каждый гражданин сейчас делает коктейли Молотова, собирает припасы, покупает оружие. Его тут будут встречать. Если он хочет, чтобы сюда пришел русский мир, его будут встречать из каждого окна. Его будут встречать из каждого угла. Мы их будем убивать, и они очень пожалеют об этом.
But as this brutal war descends further, it will be the innocent who bear the brunt of Russia's aggression. There will be many more frightening nights underground. Alex Rossi, Sky News, Dnipro.
Well, let's just remind you of where today's most devastating attacks took place. And a Russian strike on a Kiev TV tower is said to have killed 5 people, while a number of Ukrainian TV stations were taken off the air. That attack close to the centre of Kiev came shortly after Moscow warned that it was preparing to strike targets inside this city. Elsewhere, a massive explosion hit a regional administration building in Kharkiv's main square, killing at least 10 people, injuring 35, and in Brovary, an airstrike left a military airbase on fire. There is growing concern that Russia could be about to deploy some of its more destructive weaponry. US officials say that thermobaric missiles, which are capable of killing anyone inside a building they target, are at Russia's disposal. Let's bring in our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes. And Deborah, first of all, it does seem as if the net is closing here.
Yes, well, that attack on the TV station inside Kiev was really one of the first times you've actually seen weapons deployed right in the centre. And we've had, there's been a bit of gunfire just a few minutes ago in the distance. Those images, really stark images of the column of armour moving towards the city, and very much a sense that the terror that has been launched on other cities in terms of the weapons used and the devastation caused could now be coming here. And it seems as well that regardless of what threats the Western world makes to President Putin and what inside Ukraine as well, saying that this is it's madness what is happening here, it doesn't seem to be deterring him at all, and he seems intent on continuing. Yeah, and as for talks, there was said to be, when the first round of talks took place, they said there would be a second round. They'd come back with proposals. Is that now, diplomacy now, out of the window, do you think? No, it's not out the window, but as things stand, there's clearly no obvious route away from this. The Ukrainians have made very clear they will fight to the last breath, fight to the last drop of blood. And the images that we saw, particularly at the end of the piece that I did, of those civilians in Melitopol in the south on the coastline, literally standing in the road in front of this column of armoured vehicles coming towards them. And you didn't see it in the piece, but there was a Russian soldier standing there as well with a rifle shooting it into the air, obviously looking nervous at how to handle this situation. It's not a military against a military, it's a military against a civilian, an unarmed civilian who is literally willing to risk their lives to try to stop them in their track. The complete reversal of the... Oh, there's some more gunshots. The complete reversal of what President Putin had been saying, the narrative that he was here to get rid of this neo-Nazi regime here, utter nonsense, and even more insulting because the president himself is Jewish. The bravery here, I mean, has been astonishing of the military and the people.
but inevitably, do you think that Kiev does fall to the Russians?
I certainly think that if the Russian military is intent on continuing with its invasion, with the power, the firepower that it has, that on balance, even with the greatest will, which the Ukrainian military clearly has, it's got superior firepower. I mean, they have weapons. You talked about the thermobaric weapons. They have weapons at their disposal, which have the ability to inflict devastating casualties and cost, which would ultimately lead to a surrender. I mean, the hope is that there is some way to prevent that. But just to give you a little example of the toll on civilians, a doctor texted me this evening from the main children's hospital, which I visited yesterday, to say that 2 children had just been brought in, a sister and a brother. They'd just witnessed their mother die in an artillery attack. The little girl had been wounded. The doctor said she would survive. And he said that the boy, who was only about 10, had basically lost the ability to talk due to the shock that had been inflicted upon him by this.
Deborah, thank you very much indeed. Well, Russia's actions have provoked a pretty strong rebuke from NATO's allies and also from the Prince of Wales today. There was also a mass walkout at the Human Rights Council meeting when Russia's foreign minister addressed members. Well, in search of a diplomatic solution to the crisis, Prime Minister Boris Johnson travelled to Poland and Estonia today, but he was met with a barrage of criticism and questions from one Ukrainian angry at the UK's response. Sky's Alistair Bunkle has this on the diplomatic anger being felt.
The diplomatic wheels are still turning, even as Vladimir Putin's tanks are rolling closer to Kiev. Boris Johnson was on a tour of Eastern Europe to reassure NATO allies. But for all the talks he would have had with fellow leaders today, it was an emotional plea from a Ukrainian journalist at a press conference in Poland that cut straight to the point.
You're talking about more sanctions, Prime Minister, but Roman Abramovich is not sanctioned. He's in London. His children are not in the bombardments. His children are there in London. Putin's children are in Netherlands, in Germany, in mansions. Where are all these mansions seized? I don't see that. I see that my family members, that my team members are saying that we are crying. We don't have where to run.
I'm acutely conscious that there is not enough that we can do as the UK government to help in the way that you want.
The United Nations in Geneva was the centre for more diplomacy, but not the meeting that many had hoped for. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov were both due to be here, but neither came. Blinken stayed in the United States, and Sergei Lavrov said that because of the ban on Russian aircraft through European airspace, he was unable to travel. And so, in their absence, went any hope that the two men might meet in private and find some sort of breakthrough. Instead, the Russian foreign minister gave a televised address, and as he did, Western diplomats stood up and walked out. And the US Secretary of State, also speaking remotely, suggested Russia could be kicked out of the United Nations Human Rights Council.
Council members should stop using language implying that all sides bear equal responsibility for the unprovoked attack of one side. This isn't even-handed. It's wrong.
The British Foreign Secretary was there in person, and she had this to say to Vladimir Putin.
The blood is on Putin's hands, not just of innocent Ukrainians, but the men he has sent to die. He is violating international law, including the UN Charter and multiple commitments to peace and security.
On an official visit in the UK, Prince Charles spoke out in defence of democracy and open society.
We are seeing those same values under attack today in Ukraine in the most unconscionable way. In the stand we take here, we are in solidarity with all those who are resisting brutal aggression.
The Western unity has been strong and the sanctions tough. There is almost certainly more to come. But whilst it might have shocked President Putin, it hasn't stopped him. Alistair Bunkle, Sky News, Geneva.
Well, the the United States is expelling some intelligence operatives at the United Nations. The expulsion of the Russian working for the UN is in addition to the 12 Russian UN diplomats that Washington has already ordered to leave the country over national security concerns. Our US correspondent Mark Stone is in Washington. First of all, Mark, tell us more about these expulsions.
Yes, the latest announced today, which brings to 13 the number of Russian diplomats on US soil who will have to leave by the end of this week. Yesterday, the Americans announced that 12 diplomats working at the UN, the Russian mission to the United Nations, which of course is in New York on Russian soil, would have to leave, and they've added one to that number today. It's one of a flurry of bits of news that have come out from various parts from this side of the Atlantic over the course of the past few hours. From the State Department, we've had a background briefing at which they've been giving a little more detail on their view of President Putin's state of mind. They are certainly concerned that he is a man isolated from his own advisors, that he may not be receiving advice. He certainly won't be receiving dissenting advice, and that is a particular concern. Although it's interesting, they will not pass judgment specifically on his state of mind, whether or not he is rational or irrational. I've been struck at how careful the language from the Americans has been there. In terms of the Pentagon, and picking up what you were talking to Deborah Haynes about, it's their view here at the Pentagon, the Defense Department that is, that the thermobaric weapon that we've been talking about that Russia clearly possesses, they do not believe it has been used on the battlefield at the moment, although they do think that the means to deliver it is on the battlefield, so a concern there. And then on this large column of Russian vehicles that are supposedly heading your way to Kiev, they are clear that this convoy has been bogged down. It has slowed down. There are massive supply problems with it. It is running out of fuel. The soldiers within it, it is the view of the Pentagon, are running out of both of fuel and of food. Of course, we are part of an information war. How accurate is this information? We don't know, but it is certainly that is the view the Pentagon is presenting. So an awful lot of information there from various different departments, and it is the view also of the Defense Department here that 80% of Russia's forces that it amassed on that border are now in Ukraine. Only 20% remaining. Still a large fighting force, but 20% left the other side of the border.
Right, and Mark, President Biden preparing for his big speech.
Yes, Mark, the State of the Union, which will be in this building behind me tonight, is something usually that grips many Americans, but beyond America, it is not something that is a massive focus. But I think undoubtedly tonight it will, and I think President Biden, over the course of the past week, has largely ripped up what he wanted to say, and a large part of this speech will be about Ukraine, will be about casting the American president, maybe not as the world's policeman, but certainly as the leader of the free world, cementing that position as the man who has managed to garner support globally, really very easily, to isolate Russia in a way that no country has ever been isolated before. He has a global audience tonight when he makes this address, a big moment for President Biden, and he will want to make an impact.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. Well, with the Kremlin increasingly isolated by economic sanctions and Russian society starting to feel the bite, Vladimir Putin faces a growing domestic problem. How much are his people and those in his inner circle willing to pay for the cost of this war? We've heard from one of President Putin's advisors who's growing increasingly concerned by the behaviour of his boss. Let's go live to Moscow and our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn. And Dominic, what did the advisor have to say to you?
Andrei Kortunov is somebody who we are used to on our televisions justifying his president's actions. Not so much an apologist, but certainly defending Vladimir Putin in Syria and in other arenas of action. Today, though, he's very critical of the president. He said he's in shock, he's depressed, and he's not the only one, I think. There are those in the foreign policy establishment who can't understand what Putin is up to and, frankly, are stunned and in disbelief that this invasion happened. This is what Andrei Kortunov had to say to me earlier.
For a long time, I thought that a military operation was not feasible. It was not plausible. You know, I had my own cost-benefit analysis, and even if you put aside all other considerations, I thought that to go into Ukraine is not in Russia's interests, keeping in mind the collateral damage which is likely to happen after such an operation. But apparently, you know, my cost-benefit analysis did not coincide with that in the Kremlin. So I had to wake up to a new reality, and I have now, not just me, but all of us will have to live in this new reality.
That's your dry foreign policy analysis. How do you feel about this today? What are your emotions today?
Well, you know, I am trying to keep going. I'm trying to continue doing what I'm doing, but of course I'm depressed. You know, all of us are depressed, and I think that it's very embarrassing for all of us. Not only because we turned out to be wrong, but also because, of course, you know, Russia and all Russians will be in a difficult position in many countries, not even only Western countries, but all over the place for a long time. And there are many questions to which we do not have answers.
And does that make you wonder about the state of your president's mind?
Well, you know, he has his own vision. Maybe, you know, he believes that this damage is acceptable. I don't know. I don't know. It's hard to tell.
And you're someone who's supported Vladimir Putin in the past where you've thought fit and you advise the Kremlin, and today you're depressed about the way things are going.
Yeah, of course, you know, I'm depressed. I think many of us are depressed. I think that there are many people in the Kremlin who should be depressed because the price will be substantial.
Mark, what he said afterwards was that he thinks that those advisors around Putin who've been pushing for better development, for prosperity, have basically been beaten in the argument by those who are much closer to Putin now, the securocrats, if you like, the generals, the military commanders and the intelligence officials who have said to Putin, it's about survival now. They have persuaded Putin that the West is out to get him and wants regime change, wants to topple Putin from power, and therefore said that this action is necessary. While those like Kortunov are horrified at the likely cost, not just in terms of deaths, but Russia's standing in the world, its prosperity. So that battle seems to be won in the Kremlin by these hardliners around Putin, and I think that raises some pretty alarming prospects about what is likely to happen next. If those hardliners remain in the ascendancy, which seems most likely, then they will continue pushing Putin to do his worst in Ukraine. And one other point he said, I asked him particularly not just about Putin's state of mind, and you heard as far as he was prepared to go there, which is that Putin just doesn't have the same vision as Kortunov and others like him. I asked him about whether he would use nuclear weapons. Is he mad enough to do so? And he said he was unequivocal about this. He says if NATO does get involved, for instance, in imposing a no-fly zone, does get drawn in, which he doesn't think is likely, but he says if it does happen, there is no doubt, he says, that Vladimir Putin would consider using nuclear weapons.
Well, that's quite shocking, fascinating insight, interesting stuff, Dominic. Thank you very much indeed. And if you scan the QR code on the screen right now, you can listen to the Sky News Daily podcast. On today's episode, our correspondent Shinji Mariiki speaks to our security and defence editor Deborah Haynes and those who call Kiev home about what it's like to live under invasion. Plus, in tomorrow's edition, an update on how the Russian plan is progressing from Sky News' team in Moscow. You can subscribe to the Daily wherever you get your podcasts. This is Sky News live from Kiev this evening. Coming up, we'll take a look at the billionaire oligarchs feeling the effects of economic sanctions by the international community.
reach the road. There is a lot of gas being fired all around us. It is an absolute carnival kind of atmosphere out here for Prime Minister Modi's decisive victory. These students are defying the prohibitory orders, and now they're going to be arrested.
We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news.
The roads have been inundated. The only way out is to get people by boat. This on any given day would have been bustling with people, but today it's absolutely deserted. I'm Neville Lazarus, and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
Welcome back to this Sky News special programme on the Ukraine invasion. The UK has long been accused of allowing too much Russian money to filter through parts of society, earning England's capital the nickname of Londongrad. Today, one of the secretive oligarchs residing there broke cover to hit out at EU sanctions against him. Our business correspondent Paul Kelso reports now on the Russian money in London.
Mikhail Friedman built his fortune in Vladimir Putin's Russia. A deal between his oil company and BP was endorsed by the Russian president and Tony Blair. Ukrainian-born and now based in London, he's been hit by European Union sanctions, but says he has no influence on the man waging war on his homeland.
Imposing sanctions against us here just create enormous pressure for us personally. But we do not have any impact for political decision.
You say you have no links to Vladimir Putin, but despite the city of your birth being under attack, you've offered no condemnation. Some might conclude you're more concerned about your money than your country. What would you say to them?
I'm also worrying about the country, but I'm first of all worrying about people who are working for us. You know, we have a lot of very prominent people in the top management, the general management. As I said, it's hundreds of thousands of people working for us in Russia. And, I don't want to make any comment which potentially could increase their risk.
He controls a global business empire that runs from energy to retail from these London offices, benefiting, he says, from the transparency and security the city offers. Mikhail Friedman has not been sanctioned by the UK, but the government says it does have a list of oligarchs against whom it will take action as it tries to put pressure on Vladimir Putin by making life in London less comfortable and less lucrative for his super-rich allies. It's long been a magnet for foreign wealth and dirty money, says an author being sued this week for his exposé of oligarchs.
This is where you can hire the propaganda specialists, the PRs, the lawyers to defend your reputation. And of course, you can buy everything from bits of universities to mansions and private school places.
Also sanctioned by the EU, but not Britain, Uzbek billionaire Alisher Usmanov, seen here with Chelsea owner Roman Abramovich. A former shareholder in Arsenal and now sponsor of Everton, he says the allegations against him are false and will challenge the West's attempt to change the rules of the game. Paul Kelso, Sky News.
Well, President Biden has just confirmed he's held a phone call with President Zelensky. He said, I just spoke with the President to discuss our continued support for Ukraine, including security assistance and humanitarian aid as it defends itself against Russian aggression. We will hold Russia accountable, and our sanctions are already having a devastating impact. That's Joe Biden tweeting there in the last few minutes. This is Sky News. Coming up, Dozens die in rocket attacks in Kharkiv, and a 40-mile convoy of armoured Russian vehicles heads to this capital city. We'll be discussing day 6 of Europe's largest ground war in generations. Welcome back. You're watching a Sky News special programme on the Ukraine invasion. Let's get more now on the movement of Russian troops on the ground here. Video has emerged of the leader of Belarus, a key ally of Russia, seemingly wargaming the invasion. Sky's Kamali Melbourne and Air Marshal Edward Stringer are at the screen with more details.
We're joined by Air Marshal Edward Stringer to take us through the detail of the Russian advance. Air Marshal, thank you for being with us. So, as we understand it, the Russians are arrayed on at least 3 sides of Ukraine at the moment. They are, of course, around the capital, Kiev, around the Crimean Peninsula, which, of course, they're holding and pushing on from, and around the second city, Kharkiv. What does this tell us, as we see where those forces are arrayed, about the Russian advance?
Well, I'd like to treat these as two areas, Kamali. So what you see in the south here is an attempt to consolidate the hold on territory and to link up through the cities north of Crimea, which the Russians took in 2014, through the Donbass and the land bridge into Russia. But that, in and of itself, wouldn't give them the strategic outcome they want. What we see up here, if you like, in these northern group, These are two thrusts against the two main cities, the capital and the second city of Ukraine. And clearly this is an attempt to take over the seat of government and at that point force terms or surrender from the Ukrainian.
Yeah, and in terms of the attacks on the cities, we have seen a ramping up of attacks on the cities, specifically the second city, Kharkiv. Let's just take a look at some video that we saw from earlier today. This is of a missile strike in Kharkiv. Marshall, talk us through what we're seeing in this.
Well, what we're seeing here is an attempt at a precision strike. And if that was, and we can't be sure, but if that was an Iskander missile, 500-kilometre range, probably launched from at least hundreds of kilometres away, with an accuracy of between 5 and 30 metres, and a large warhead in the 1,000-pound category. But what we see from subsequent images, it might not actually have even hit the building, and it detonated in the front here, still causing, of course,
it causes huge damage, doesn't it? You can see it damages all the building all the way to the very top.
Significant damage to the building, and of course, tragically, deaths. Those out in front.
I mean, that is the second city, Kharkiv, but of course there is, as we understand it, a huge column of Russian forces making their way towards Kiev. They're just outside the capital. I think we think that the column is maybe 40 miles long. We can see it here. You can see that is the route that we're thinking is taking towards the capital, Kiev. Now, we can't be certain, of course, what is in that column. But what does this tell us? That there may well be that number of forces on their way to Kiev. What does it tell us about the Russian plan?
Well, what you've got in this 40-mile convoy, and we don't know the exact makeup of it from the imagery we've seen, but a 40-mile convoy typically would suggest something like an armoured or a tank, that's a tank division, which would have roughly 300 tanks, 300 infantry fighting vehicles, around 140 significant pieces of self-propelled artillery, and then a load of trucks to provide the logistic tail and the support that requires.
And I think we've got satellite image as well of the convoy that we can have a look at as well, which just shows the depth of forces that this convoy has. As you can see there, they're sort of arrayed 3 deep along that road, and it's said that it's 40 miles long. I mean, they look like transports to me, but you'll know in more detail what they may well be.
Yeah, indeed, these do look like trucks. But what this tells you is the Russians must be quite confident at the moment, because you would not leave this number of vehicles so densely packed if you feared air attack or ambush from the side. So what this tells us is probably that the Ukrainian forces at the moment are husbanding their combat power, their fighting forces, and those are probably back in those cities that we spoke about, because those are the vital seats of government that they must protect.
Absolutely right. The fight does continue. Air Marshal Stringer, thank you very much.
The latest situation on the ground here, well, there are mounting fears that a major assault on the capital is on the horizon as this 40-mile convoy advances towards Kiev. Slowly, it has to be said, but how fearful should we be about the future of this city? Joining me now is Adam Thompson, a former UK permanent representative to NATO and the director of the European Leadership Network, and Dr. Patricia Lewis, nuclear physicist and arms control expert and head of the International Security Programme at Chatham House. Welcome to you both. Thank you very much. And Sir Adam, first of all, how dangerous a moment do you think this is?
I think it's an extremely dangerous moment, not just for Ukrainians, but for the whole of the Russia-West relationship. It's clear from your images of that 40-mile-long convoy and the increasing evidence of Russian attacks on civilian targets that the Russian invasion is about to enter a really much uglier phase. If that happens, Ukrainian and Western resolve will deepen ever more to ensure that President Putin suffers a strategic failure in Ukraine, and it will just get that much harder to negotiate any way out of this. So there's a very little amount of time left, I think, now for the sides to come to some sort of pause, an unconditional ceasefire that would allow some space for negotiation.
And Sir Adam, I mean, do you think there is a chance that that could happen still before an attack?
But I think it is what we should all be pressing for. I'm not hopeful because there is no evidence so far that the reality of the world he is creating has really yet penetrated to President Putin, who is in these circumstances the only person who matters, and whose understanding of what is actually happening to Russia and to the relationship with the West may be quite imperfect.
And Dr. Lewis, I'm interested in your thoughts about the timing of this, I suppose, warning you'd call it, from Putin, you know, talking about his nuclear alert.
Yes, I mean, the timing is interesting. Right from the beginning, before the invasion, he had a veiled nuclear threat, and now taking forces off peacetime status and going into combat alert. Clearly, it's a signal that he is feeling under some pressure, but also that he feels he needs to up the ante and make us all very frightened of what he might do next. And it's very interesting to see the different reactions around the world as to what he's said.
And do you think it's connected, Patricia, to this, you know, warning to NATO to stay out of whatever it is that Vladimir Putin wants to do here in Ukraine?
Oh, yes, that was right from the beginning. Stay out of my business. It's none of your business. It's nothing to do with NATO. And then if you do, then there's the possibility of using nuclear weapons. But the idea that he would actually attack a NATO state with nuclear weapons seems really a step too far, even for the way he's behaving. But the thing is, I think we have to take him seriously, because although we may want to, in our minds, dismiss it, he has made good on his threats all the way through. And he is behaving in a way that is quite outrageous, quite despicable. And so if we don't take his threat seriously, we will be then unprepared. And I think one of the things we have to do is communicate to the Russian people that we are not threatening them in any way, that we would have to respond, but we would respond in a non-nuclear way, at least in the first instance, so that they are not under the impression that it's NATO that's making the nuclear threat, which is what he would want to portray if he could.
And Sir Adam, this idea that's floated by some about, you know, a no-fly zone, enforcing some sort of no-fly zone, I mean, what do you make of that at all? I mean, non-starter?
You can't blame Ukrainians for suggesting it, but it could only be enforced by the United States, and it would take NATO and Russia straight into confrontation. I hope it is a non-starter, because I agree with Patricia that President Putin's threats have to be taken seriously. When I was ambassador at NATO, while Crimea was being annexed and Donbass invaded, we also had out-of-sequence Russian nuclear exercises, just as we did ahead of the invasion this time. And it's a signal of trouble to come, I think, from President Putin, although we have not yet seen any significant shifts in actual Russian nuclear status resulting from his warnings. Instead, I think we really need to think in NATO about what off-ramps can still be offered to President Putin in the possible event that he would want to take them. I mean, we might consider, for example, suggesting what he has to do in order to get sanctions reversed. So far, we've just imposed them without saying how to get rid of them. We need to be thinking about how we design this, sadly, probably long-term confrontation with Russia in ways that suit us. Do we want some scope for long-term cooperation with Russia and not just out-and-out expensive and dangerous confrontation? And in a shorter term, we need to be, and this goes back to your point about no-fly zones, we need to be conducting ourselves with the lowest possible risks of West Russia clashes, something that my organization, the European Leadership Network, has called for many years, is military-to-military contacts between senior NATO and Russian commanders to iron out misunderstanding.
Okay, Sir Adam, thank you very much. And Dr. Lewis, appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed. I just want to bring you these pictures that we mentioned just a few moments ago, and they seem to show Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, a key ally, of course, of Russia, mapping out troop movements on the ground. And we're having our experts analyze these pictures in some detail, and we'll bring you more on that throughout the evening. Well, the Prime Minister visited Poland and Estonia today as Western leaders put on a united front in the face of Russia's aggression here. During a speech in Warsaw this morning, Boris Johnson was confronted by a Ukrainian journalist and campaigner who told him that NATO must do more to protect Ukrainian civilians from Russian bombs. Daria Kalinyuk, who is from Kiev, this is what she had to say.
Britain guaranteed our security under Budapest Memorandum. So you're coming to Poland. You're not coming to Kiev, Prime Minister. You're not coming to Lviv. Because you're afraid. Because NATO is not willing to defend. Because NATO is afraid of World War III. But it is already started. And these are Ukrainian children who are there taking the hit. You're talking about more sanctions, Prime Minister. But Roman Abramovich is not sanctioned. He's in London. His children are not in the bombardments. His children are there in London. Putin's children are in Netherlands, in Germany, in mansions. Where are all these mansions seized? I don't see that. I see that my family members, that my team members are saying that we are crying. We don't have where to run.
Well,
this is what is happening, Prime Minister.
Well, thank you very much for your questions, and thank you for getting here today. And I'm glad that you have been able to get here. And look, I just want to say that I'm acutely conscious that there is not enough that we can do as the UK government to help in the way that you want. And I've got to be honest about that. And when you talk about the no-fly zone, as I said to Volodymyr Zelensky, I think a couple of times, unfortunately, the implication of that is that the UK and would be engaged in shooting down Russian planes, would be engaged in direct combat with Russia. That's not something that we can do.
Well, Daria Kalinyuk is the Executive Director of the Anti-Corruption Action Centre, and she joins me now. Thank you for being with us. It was a very powerful moment at that press conference. Just tell me why you don't think the West is doing enough.
It's hard to answer to your question because, while we are talking, I have my team members who live in shelters, in bomb shelters. There is Ukrainian National Hospital with children with heart diseases, which was hit with a missile. And these kids which need surgery are now in the basement hiding from the missiles. My city where I studied, Kharkiv, the downtown city, of the city was bombed by this Iskander missile. So, and you know what? In a day or two, millions and millions of Ukrainians will have no access to food, will have no access to medicine, will have no access to fuel. So we will be in isolation, and it will be the genocide against Ukrainian people, and entire world will simply observe and will be thinking like this, experts from London saying, okay, let's think what else we can give to Putin. I think the West has to stop thinking what to give to Putin. The West has to start thinking how to punish Putin and how to actually have strength to stand up and adhere to its promises. And it was my point to Prime Minister Boris Johnson, because Ukraine had nuclear weapons and we gave it up for the assurances that if anyone attacks us, there will be a response and there will be help. And now the UK is saying, we are not even willing to shut all these missiles. We are not willing to help to protect your sky. It's humiliating, and it's a hypocrisy.
But what they are doing is supplying weapons. They are imposing some of the toughest sanctions. And Boris Johnson's point about the no-fly zone, I mean, it could easily lead to clashes with the Russian Air Force, and that, who knows where that could lead in terms of a much broader war.
Listen, I already heard these arguments a couple of weeks and a couple of months ago, that we are not imposing tough sanctions on Russia. We are not stopping Nord Stream 2 because it will irritate Russia. Let's give up something to Putin. Let's let him operate. Let's give some money. Let's take some money from him. Let's let his oligarchs, who are actually war criminals, to park their assets in our luxurious mansions in Great Britain or in French Riviera. But this led us to the most devastating war Europe had since the last 70 years. And you think that this continuous appeasement of Putin and afraidness to irritate him will prevent World War III or prevent nuclear strikes? And I will say you something. Ukraine has 4 nuclear power plants across the country. And any missile, any time from Russia could hit these nuclear power plants. And this will be no more just the Ukrainian territory. It will be up in the air, flying across the entire world, and first of all to Europe, to NATO states. And I'm now appealing to NATO states, saying that it's the immediate danger to NATO that any missile from Russia can hit Ukrainian nuclear power plants and then blow up radiation on innocent people across Europe. So NATO has to stand up and hit at least missiles. I'm not talking to hit planes. I'm talking that there has to be immediately invented alternative instrument to no-fly zone, which has to protect Ukrainian sky. And that's full stop. It's extraordinary times, which requires extraordinary leadership and which requires extraordinary and quick solutions.
And just finally, in 20 seconds, I'm afraid it's all we've got. Do you think an attack on Kiev is inevitable now?
It's happening. Come on. What is the question? The attack on Kyiv is already happening. Their missile from Russia was trying to target dam on Dnipro River, and Ukrainian army destroyed that missile. But next time Ukrainian army will fail to do so, there will be water flood, killing 1 million Ukrainian people. Come on, wake up. It's World War III already happening, and everybody is just observing how Ukraine is taking the hit and applauding. You are so brave, Ukrainians, but we are not going to intervene. We will do the photo opportunity at the border with Ukraine, in Poland or in Romania. Wake up, guys.
Okay, Daria, listen, thank you very much for being with us and appreciate your time. Strong views there from a Ukrainian who put that case to Boris Johnson, as we saw earlier today. Well, here it's been another violent day with attacks here in the capital, Kiev, and serious missile assaults on intensive bombing of Kharkiv, the second biggest city. Day 6 of this invasion comes to an end with a sense of great foreboding here.